Lee Strobel states he was an atheist during his series of interviews which eventually led to the writing of The Case for Christ. Well, this episode is an example of an incredibly slanted interview, which leads one to believe he wasn't an atheist at all at the time. Well, this episode now represents the fifth person that Lee Strobel interviewed, which I've now fact-checked and researched in depth, which is something I didn't do decades ago the first time I read his book, and was very convinced by his arguments at the time. But now that I've come back years later, with a much greater accessibility, to look into the merit of this interview, it makes me believe that Lee Strobel, yes, may have been an atheist in the past, but I don't believe he was one when he did these interviews. I think he was only reconfirming to himself his reconversion to Christianity that just hadn't been made official yet. For this interview we're covering today is with one Dr. Gregory Boyd. Yes, another heavy hitter in the Christian apologist world. And a great deal of this chapter in his book was nothing more than an attack on the Westar Institute's Jesus Seminar, which took place between 1985 and 1998. As a matter of fact, Mr. Strobel sets the tone of the chapter by immediately slanting against the Westar Institute before he even started Dr. Boyd's contentions as just a liberal left-wing thinking tank whose purpose was nothing but to discredit the Bible with their biased left-wing philosophy. Well, I did a prior episode which addressed the Westar Institute's finding in the Jesus Seminar, and I never looked what their politics were. I looked at their credentials, their methods, and their findings. They initially started with 30 New Testament scholars who were not aligned with any specific denomination. And over this 13 years, it was divided into 3 sections, determining legitimacy of the sayings of Jesus, the deeds of Jesus, and his general portrayal of who he was. For the sayings of Jesus part, whose investigation alone in the seminar lasted 6 years, I believe, they took 500 items and 1,500 versions of these items, and the scholars met multiple times a year, with many technical papers written, in which they voted with colored beads of probability that Jesus actually said what they said he said. And the tone of this interview about the seminar's findings of low probability that these deeds and sayings actually happened is largely critiqued and discredited by most scholars because of their biased left-wing agenda. And that's just not true. There are many critiques, usually from evangelical and fundamentalist apologists. And the largest critique of the Westar Institute is that they're going in with an assumption that the supernatural didn't happen, which is the attitude they exactly should be going in with. Because if you go in believing the supernatural occurred, then you are going to be doing your investigation through a tainted lens. And Dr. Boyd's worldview is clearly shown to be wearing these glasses as the chapter proceeds. As Strobel is also using in this chapter, Dr. Boyd's clash with the Jesus Seminar in 1996. He portrays them as a radical fringe group of the New Testament. That section of the chapter is labeled Writings from a Radical Fringe, whose only objective is to rescue us from Christian fundamentalism. To which I say, good. I hope a lot of Christian fundamentalist teenagers look into this. And I don't know how fundamentalist Dr. Boyd actually is. He is a credited scholar with a Master's of Divinity and a PhD from the Princeton Theological Seminary. So as usual, Lee Strobel picks Christian apologists, but they do have well-educated backgrounds. He is an Anabaptist, which I've never heard of before, but apparently it traces his roots to the Radical Reformation. He did come out of a sect of Pentecostalism when he was younger, but he is a pastor of the Woodland Hills Church in Minnesota, which is described as evangelical. And again, I'm not sure how fundamentalist it is or not, but in his core beliefs, he does quote Genesis a bit. He is described as more of a progressive evangelical, but he does seem to reside a bit in that traditional camp. And he also does support, it appears, the separation of church and state completely, which he's taken a great deal of heat from fundamentalists. So I at least appreciate that, Dr. Boyd. But what I can't appreciate is his contention that he has this ironclad proof that Jesus' sayings and doings and resurrection is exactly as portrayed by the Bible. And again, I have no problem with his belief system. I have a problem with his saying it's evidence and proof. For one of his major contentions was that Jesus was a one-of-a-kind miracle man, and the magnitude of the miracles he performed shows its legitimacy. And he also has a great contention that Jews and Christians borrowed some of these supernatural stories from other cultures. And one of these stories he uses to compare is the story of Apologists, which also portrays someone who was raised from the dead, healed people, and cast out demons. And he notes very emphatically that this was written in the 1st century, so it was copied from the Christian myth, not the other way around. Okay, fair enough. That's probably true for that story. But Dr. Boyd, there are many stories of a virgin birth and resurrection from the dead in other cultures prior to Yeshua's coming. So you can't just cherry pick one story that probably was copied from the Christians and say that proves the legitimacy of all the Christian stories, whose legitimacy you state is the focus on the supernatural. And Dr. Boyd also argues the point that many of these sayings, miracles, and such, that he emphatically disagrees that early church writers placed quotes and events in the text long after the fact, long after Yeshua was deceased. And I don't know what to tell you there, Dr. Boyd. We already know that the word for virgin wasn't virgin in Isaiah 7:14, and we have the Dead Sea Scrolls with the complete manuscript of Isaiah that clearly show that early church writers manipulated the text to make the New Testament match the Old Testament. Because one of Dr. Boyd's major contentions in the interview was that, quote, Jews carefully guarded their beliefs from outside sources, unquote. No, they didn't, Dr. Boyd. The entire story of Genesis was taken from outside sources, from ancient Sumerian and Babylonian texts. The entire premise of our creation wasn't theirs. There are other versions of the Moses story in other cultures. Ancient Hebrews borrowed myths, legends, stories, and fables all the time. And it is astounding to me with your level of education, Dr. Boyd, that you don't know that. And it's more astounding, Lee Strobel, that you didn't call him on that as this objective atheist interviewer as you portrayed yourself to be. Now, there have been other accounts of Yeshua's life that didn't make it into the modern-day Bible, Gospel of St. Thomas being one of them, and a secret Mark book written supposedly, and scholars have been arguing, as Dr. Boyd did, whether the writing of this work was even legitimate. And he may be right. And he also contends that this different portrayal of Christ's life in that Gospel of St. Thomas was written in the mid-2nd century and influenced greatly by Gnosticism. And you know what? That seems to be a very fair point. But then where he's not being objective is when he turns around and says the Gospels that made it into the modern Bible, whether New American or King James, do, quote, pass the test of historical scrutiny with flying colors, unquote. No, Dr. Boyd, they haven't been confirmed completely as historically correct. It is a matter of constant debate with the scholars. The things that most scholars have a consensus of being historically correct was that there was a Jesus. Most do believe he had a cousin named John the Baptist who baptized him, that he had a following, that there was a trial where he was executed, that Pontius Pilate did indeed exist, and a following who was willing to be martyred continued on after him. Dr. Boyd, this does not conclude that the general consensus of scholars are in agreement that all these supernatural events occurred. And there is no evidence outside of your own biblical verses that shows they did occur. The fact is, Dr. Boyd, once again, we do not have any original authorship of any of these Gospels from eyewitnesses who were actually there. And we don't even know who wrote the copies. And then he uses the Sermon of Peter in the 2nd chapter of Acts as proof for the legitimacy as Yeshua being the true Messiah with these supernatural qualities. And then right after that states that this shows that the liberal scholars aren't living in reality, an argument he uses in that later clash with the Westar Institute. The early copies we have surviving of Acts, Dr. Boyd, are in mid-3rd century according to one source. Some argue 2nd century at best. So no, this seems to be the typical Christian apologist talking point of the Bible is because the Bible says. Dr. Boyd has not offered any actual evidence of proof of anything. But here's the end point. Lee Strobel at the end of the chapter quotes himself as saying there is little room left for doubt of Dr. Boyd's contentions. Well, Lee, if that doesn't prove you weren't objective during this interview, then I don't know what does. If you're going to write a Christian apologist book, just use your belief system like other Christian writers do. Don't try to put a twist that you were this objective atheist and was just somehow instantly convinced based on these very weak arguments. Did you ever, Lee, go to the people from the Westar Institute all those years later before you published this book. See, that's what a high-caliber legal journalist, an award-winning legal journalist, would have done. Because some of you watching the video have probably caught on by now of how strangely this chapter was actually written in terms of the timeline. The interview was done somewhere between 1980 and 1981, where Dr. Boyd laid down these contentions, and the Westar Institute's investigation of the Jesus Seminar didn't even start till 1985. And then he writes that Dr. Boyd's clash with the Jesus Seminar proponents occurred in 1996, long after Lee converted, as his book was published in 1998. So he was initially convinced by Dr. Boyd's arguments, still hadn't written the book when there was a clash with the Westar Institute's findings, wrote that book but then didn't get a countering opinion from anyone in the Westar Institute, just continued to advance Dr. Boyd's contentions as legitimate in the book The Case for Christ, which you continue to hammer in the second edition that I recently read. So this is why I'm continuing to go after the guy. I do not buy that he was a legitimate, objective atheist who was so easily convinced by Dr. Boyd's arguments and biased against the Westar Institute's findings, which he also used for his support base in this chapter. Because I don't believe he interviewed Dr. Boyd or researched the later Westar Institute's findings with any real objectivity whatsoever. And if you'd like to see some more material of me taking shots at Mr. Strobel, click on my playlist card at the end of the video. And check out my own tale, which at least I admit is fiction, The Second Fall, an offbeat apocalypse sure to offend Lee Strobel, and probably a few others. Link is on the video descriptions as well as a channel page banner, and I will see you next time as we once again take that sword of reason and reality and thrust it right through the heart of ignorance.